The early afternoon sun filtered gently through the high glass walls of the luxury car dealership, nestled in the heart of downtown Arlington, Virginia, casting warm golden streaks across the glossy hoods of Bentleys, Aston Martins, and high-end Mercedes-Benz models. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Kane, recently retired from the United States Navy after 22 years of decorated service, strolled in quietly, his frame relaxed but deliberate, every step echoing a lifetime of military precision he no longer had to announce. At 6'3" with a broad chest and the carved muscle of a seasoned combat operator, Marcus could appear intimidating to the untrained eye, but beneath his calm demeanor was a mind trained for control, a man who had served in theaters of war that most Americans only knew about through redacted headlines or action films. He wore a plain navy hoodie, dark jeans, and clean sneakers, not flashy, not conspicuous, just comfortable clothes for a man who'd finally been told he could breathe again after 2 decades of covert missions, silent kills, classified rescues, and invisible wounds. Today wasn't supposed to be dramatic. It was supposed to be a celebration of freedom, a quiet reward to himself, a new vehicle, nothing outrageous, just something sleek and reliable he could call his own without needing to requisition it from an armory or park it next to a Humvee in a dust-blown phobby. He had his VA card, military ID, driver's license, and enough cash in the bank to buy 2 of the showroom's vehicles if he wanted to, but none of that mattered when 2 uniformed patrol officers walked in behind him and saw what they weren't trained to understand. A black man, tall, muscular, composed, browsing next to a red Bentley with the confident ease of someone who belonged. Their posture shifted before they even spoke, a silent alarm triggered in their bodies by years of conditioning, prejudice, and the quiet fear of authority being challenged by someone they couldn't classify. The sales rep, a young man in a suit, who had just offered Marcus a coffee, noticed the tension immediately, his smile faltering as the officers approached with that specific kind of performative authority that meant they didn't come in to ask. They came to assume. "Sir," one of them said sharply, already resting a hand near his belt, "can we see some ID?" Marcus turned slowly, not because he was nervous, but because he had learned the rhythm of dangerous moments. He gave a nod, reached calmly into his back pocket, and produced his license and military ID without flinching. The officer looked at the card without even really reading it, then exchanged a look with his partner. An unspoken agreement had already been reached. Too big, too black, too calm to be innocent. "Step outside with us," the first officer said, already moving in. "Am I under arrest?" Marcus asked, not with defiance but with quiet clarity. "We just want to ask you some questions," the second officer chimed in, but his hand was already reaching for cuffs. "I have every right to be here," Marcus said. "I'm interested in this car. The sales team knows—" But before the sentence ended, cold steel snapped around his wrists with a familiarity he hadn't felt since capturing high-value targets overseas. His hands were behind his back, his posture forced downward slightly, and the entire room fell into stunned silence. The sales manager stepped forward hesitantly. "Officers, I can vouch for him, he's a customer." But he was waved off with a dismissive glare. Marcus didn't resist, he didn't raise his voice, he didn't call out. Not because he was weak, but because he was dangerous in ways they couldn't imagine, and restraint was his first weapon. He'd taken out threats at half a mile in blowing desert wind with one breath. He'd slipped into compounds undetected to retrieve intelligence that reshaped global strategy. He'd watched brothers bleed out in his arms, and kept moving anyway. This was nothing but a new kind of battlefield, one where skin color and ignorance substituted for enemy uniforms. His mind remained still, cataloging exits, memorizing faces, noting the camera positions overhead. One woman in the corner, a customer holding her toddler, fumbled for her phone and began recording. Another man stepped aside, muttering to his wife, "This is messed up." Still, the officers escorted Kane outside, walking him past his own parked car, a modest black sedan, toward their cruiser. "We got a report about someone casing vehicles," the first officer muttered, as if the accusation would justify everything. "You match the description." Marcus didn't speak. Let them talk. Let them think. Let them act with impunity, under the illusion of superiority, because that illusion was about to shatter in a way they wouldn't forget. For now he stood next to the squad car, wrists aching slightly, mind unbothered, body still like a loaded weapon at rest. "You're making a mistake," he said once quietly. "You have no idea who I am." The officers chuckled. "Sure, Rambo," one muttered. "You can tell that to the desk sergeant." The dealership staff looked on, torn between fear and outrage. Nobody moved fast enough, nobody knew how to help, except for one person, someone watching from the upstairs office with wide eyes and a trembling hand, now dialing a number few civilians had access to. And that call, sparked by injustice, whispered down the wires of military protocol like a spark to dry powder, destined to change everything. Marcus Kane had survived war zones where politics, chaos, and death walked hand in hand, but he'd never expected that his most public battle would begin not with gunfire, but with the quiet clicking of handcuffs outside a showroom window on a sunny Saturday afternoon in his own country, at home, as a civilian, unarmed, but never unprepared. In the upstairs glass-paneled office of the dealership, Danielle Rourke, the regional manager and a former Air Force logistics officer turned executive, stared in disbelief as the scene unfolded below her. Her fingertips trembled slightly as they hovered over her phone's keypad, the faces of the two officers registering in her mind like names added to a list that would soon matter deeply. She'd only spoken to Marcus Kane briefly before stepping away to handle a conference call, but the quiet power in his demeanor was unmistakable. His posture, his tone, his eyes, all carried that elusive imprint that only those who had faced mortal danger carried without ever saying a word. She recognized it instantly, not because she was trained in law enforcement, but because she had seen it in the mirror and in her father's face growing up. Her father had served with Kane's former unit, the legendary DevGru, back when operations were buried deeper than the headlines could reach. When she'd returned to the floor moments before, coffee in hand, she watched as two local patrol cops approached him with unwarranted hostility. Her heart sank. It wasn't just a misstep. It was a full-blown humiliation. She knew this man wasn't just some veteran browsing a showroom. Something in the way he stood, the stillness, the alert eyes despite his relaxed stance, told her he had once commanded situations more complex than any this dealership would ever face. Her instincts screamed at her, and with the urgency of someone who had once coordinated emergency airlifts under fire, she picked up her private phone, the one she hadn't used in years for a call like this, and dialed a number etched in memory, one she reserved for the rarest of occasions. It rang once. Then a gruff, clipped voice answered, "General Tanner." "Sir, it's Danielle Rourke. You may not remember me. I served under Colonel Mallory, Logistics Command out of Ramstein." There was a pause, then a warmer, more alert response. "Rourke, of course I do. What's going on?" Her voice didn't shake. "Sir, I have a situation here. A retired Chief Petty Officer, Marcus Kane, is being handcuffed in front of my staff and customers by two Arlington PD officers. No cause, no warrant. They claim he matches a description. Sir, this man, he's one of ours, the kind you probably briefed top brass about." The line went quiet. "Did you say Marcus Kane?" Tanner's tone shifted immediately. Hard, tactical, command level. "So yes, sir, right now he's outside, still calm, but they're treating him like a criminal. Don't hang up, I need the dealership's address. Text it now." Within seconds, she did, and within the next 90, wheels were turning. Inside a network civilians never saw, a network that connected warfighters, flag officers, and the very core of U.S. strategic operations. General Tanner was not just any officer. He was a 4-star, retired from operational command only 2 years earlier, but still active on defense advisory panels and the Pentagon's Critical Veterans Affairs Task Force. He didn't make calls. He issued directives. And now the Arlington PD was about to learn what it meant to detain someone whose name was known in rooms lined with American flags and battle maps, someone whose fingerprints had unlocked missions never disclosed to the press. As Danielle watched from the window, she could see Marcus's shoulders set, not in aggression but in composure. He wasn't worried. He was calculating. She remembered an old quote from her father about operators like Kane. They don't panic, because they've already seen the worst and lived through it. Down below, the officers were finishing whatever paperwork they thought justified their actions, unaware that a black Suburban with tinted windows had just pulled out of a secured garage beneath the Pentagon. Inside was General Tanner, his uniform jacket folded beside him, dressed in a crisply ironed civilian suit, eyes burning with the fire of a man who had spent his life demanding precision, respect, and above all, justice for his men. He was not going to call a press conference. He wasn't going to file a complaint. He was going to walk in that dealership and do what generals do best, command the moment. Because this wasn't just about Marcus Kane. It was about the symbol, the wound, the eternal insult. Men like Kane fought wars overseas, only to return and be treated as suspects in their own neighborhoods. Tanner wasn't going to let that stand. Meanwhile, Danielle came downstairs, her heels clicking against the showroom floor like gunshots in the silence. She approached the lead officer with the kind of posture that made even civilians look twice. "I suggest you uncuff him immediately," she said coolly. "We've just contacted someone in his chain of command." The officer sneered. "Lady, this is a local matter. He's being detained for matching a suspect's profile." Marcus said nothing but looked at Danielle, his eyes quietly thanking her. "Not anymore," she said. "Help is coming, and it's wearing stars." That's when the siren stopped being the loudest thing in the scene, because a quiet storm was on its way, and Arlington PD had no idea they had just handcuffed a living weapon whose name belonged on monuments, not mugshots. The Arlington dealership, usually a hub of casual sales chatter and shiny auto showroom calm, had shifted into a tense bubble of confused stares and hushed whispers as the minutes ticked by following Danielle Rourke's urgent call. Outside, the scene remained unchanged on the surface. Marcus Kane still stood with his hands loosely secured behind his back, head held high. The patrol officers obliviously self-assured in their action, believing they had stopped a man matching a description, unaware they had just tripped an invisible wire strung across national honor and high-ranking loyalties that spanned continents. Across town, traffic lights seemed to bend to the path of a dark SUV flanked by a pair of black sedans, moving with synchronized fluidity, not speeding, but granted silent priority by an unseen chain of authority that traced its origin to the Pentagon's private corridors. Inside the lead vehicle, General Thomas Tanner sat upright, silver hair immaculately combed, his sharp eyes locked on the route ahead as he reviewed the brief sent from his aide, Kane's full profile, the officers, badge numbers, the audio from Danielle's call, all delivered over secure lines. The general's jaw tightened, not just from fury but from shame, a personal shame because Marcus Kane wasn't just another name in the defense archives. He was a legend, a ghost among operators, credited for precision strikes in the mountains. Say of Afghanistan, rescues from collapsing embassies and more than one classified mission that had quietly prevented war. Tanner had once debriefed Kane personally after a covert assignment involving nuclear assets in the Horn of Africa, and never forgot the sniper's report, direct, detailed, emotionally unshaken even when recounting a night of fire and bloodshed. To see a man like that, who had once risked death without hesitation, now degraded on a suburban sidewalk by men who didn't know who he was, made something stir in Tanner's chest that hadn't awakened since Fallujah. Back at the dealership, Marcus remained calm but watchful, not because he couldn't break free, but because he was waiting for something far more powerful than brute force. He knew the moment justice arrived would speak louder than retaliation ever could. The officers were beginning to notice that bystanders had taken out their phones, that even passing customers who knew nothing of Kane's identity looked uneasy because everything about the scene reeked of overreach. This was not a man resisting, this was a man enduring. Suddenly there was movement at the curb, not loud but decisive. A black SUV came to a silent halt. The doors clicked, and from the back emerged a tall, broad-shouldered figure wearing a tailored civilian suit with a subtle flag pin on his lapel, the kind of man whose walk commanded silence and whose aura demanded explanation. General Tanner didn't speak at first. He simply walked directly toward the officer holding Marcus, his eyes boring into the young man's face until the officer unconsciously straightened up, sensing something was wrong, something bigger than him. Danielle stepped forward quickly, murmuring, "That's him," to the confused staff nearby, and then followed a few steps behind as Tanner arrived, looking at Kane not with pity, but with the kind of steel respect only warriors exchanged. "Marcus," he said, his voice low but sharp, "stand easy." Kane gave a curt nod, and the general turned on the officers, who were now beginning to panic slightly, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere. "Who authorized this detention?" Tanner asked, voice as calm as a razor blade. The lead officer cleared his throat and said, "Sir, we had reports. He matched a suspect's description. It's standard protocol to—" "You handcuffed a decorated Navy sniper with clearance levels above your precinct commanders. Pay grade in public without cause," Tanner interrupted, producing a laminated card from his coat, a Federal Defense ID, and added, "And you just detained a national asset with over 40 confirmed operations, all classified, many under my direct command. Congratulations, officer. You've just handcuffed one of the most lethal protectors of this country over a vague description and a lack of critical thinking." The younger cop looked visibly shaken now, his hand inching toward the cuffs as if to remove them, but Tanner held up a finger. "Not yet," he said, turning to Danielle. "Get your security camera footage downloaded. We're filing a report with the VA Oversight Board and the Pentagon's Civil Military Relations Unit. Arlington PD just bought themselves a congressional oversight hearing." Then, without waiting, Tanner stepped beside Marcus, placed a hand gently on his shoulder, a signal, an apology not in words but in rank, and nodded to the cuffs. The officer fumbled with the key, finally unlocking them, and as the cuffs clicked open, there was a subtle shift in the crowd. People who had said nothing before now stood straighter, witnessing something rare, a quiet correction of authority, gone wrong not by protest or outburst, but by chain of command. Marcus flexed his hands briefly, rolled his shoulders once, and looked at Tanner with a measured expression that said more than thanks. It said he still trusted the flag, even when it faltered. The general didn't smile, but there was a flicker of warmth as he said, "Let's go inside, Marcus. We have some records to clean up and a few reputations to rebuild, starting with yours." As they walked into the dealership, the crowd parted without being asked, and the officers stood behind, mute, not from orders, but from the crushing realization that they had not only arrested the wrong man, they had arrested the wrong legacy. Inside the glass doors, Danielle had already called her regional PR office and legal counsel, and her staff stood at full attention, not for a customer, but for a man who had quietly worn America's burdens on his back, only to be welcomed. Home with suspicion instead of salutes, but not today, not anymore. The echo of the unlocked handcuffs hadn't yet faded, when the real weight of what had just occurred began to ripple through the Arlington dealership, through its staff, its customers, and most importantly, the officers who had, just moments before, been operating under the illusion of authority unchallenged. As General Tanner led Marcus Kane through the glass doors into the showroom, a storm was already beginning to brew behind the scenes. Emails were pinging through official channels. Danielle's emergency escalation had triggered a corporate, legal response, and across town, Arlington PD's command center was fielding calls from the Department of Defense's liaison office, a quiet but unmistakable pressure building in waves, because the system had failed, not just administratively, but symbolically, and in the center of it all stood Kane, calm, composed, but radiating a quiet wrath that didn't need shouting or threats. His very presence now was indictment enough, because no one in that room could look at him and say they didn't feel the shift in gravity, as if they'd just learned their neighbor was a mythic figure hiding in plain sight, a protector so elite even his name was whispered only in top-secret briefings. Tanner had chosen not to leave after the apology. He remained, stepping with Kane into Danielle's office, where the blinds were drawn and the walls turned silent, witness to a flurry of military-grade communication. The general was coordinating a multi-pronged response, one part internal Pentagon memo, to ensure Kane's record and rank were fully reinstated and revalidated to all public and civilian authorities, one part civilian outreach, crafting a narrative that would shield Kane from media exploitation while holding the Arlington Police Department accountable without causing public chaos. because the stakes were not just about one man, but what he represented. The invisible class of warriors who operated silently in defense of a nation that too often forgot them when they returned. Danielle sat across from them, still visibly rattled, but professionally firm, her legal team already drafting statements and liaising with Kane's Veteran Affairs contacts to document not only the event, but the psychological cost of this public humiliation. Kane, meanwhile, had said little since the cuffs had come off, but it was in that silence that his power truly emerged. When he finally spoke, it wasn't about his arrest or the disrespect. It was about patterns, about how often men and women like him faced similar indignities under different uniforms and different assumptions. "It wasn't just me out there," he said, eyes locked on Tanner. "There are others, guys who serve beside me, who never speak up, who just swallow this stuff until it eats them. Today it was me. Tomorrow it's someone who doesn't." "Have a general on speed dial." Tanner nodded gravely, and that was the moment the meeting turned into something else, a mission, not a covert operation this time, but an institutional reckoning. The next steps happened in a flurry of efficient silence. Kane's full record was recertified and transmitted to every relevant federal and state department. The officers involved were quietly placed on administrative review, pending disciplinary hearings. The dealership released a public statement, co-authored with Kane, condemning profiling and announcing a new veterans hiring and training initiative in Kane's name. National veteran organizations began reaching out. What started as a humiliating mistake was quickly becoming a symbol of overdue correction. Kane received hundreds of messages, most private, from fellow veterans, elite operators, and even a few generals, all expressing their support and shame at how he'd been treated. But Kane remained grounded. He refused to let the moment turn into a personal brand or political stunt. Instead, he chose action. Within 48 hours, he announced the formation of the Kane Initiative, a non-profit aimed at educating law enforcement on veteran engagement and implicit bias, offering training programs built not on blame, but on tactical empathy. Understanding how to see beyond uniforms, race, or surface demeanor to recognize service, stress, and sacrifice. Danielle offered her full support, even donating the dealership's conference room for the initiative's first planning session. What astonished most people wasn't just how fast Kane moved, it was how gracefully he refused to turn bitterness into spectacle. Even when national news outlets began picking up the story, Kane declined interviews unless the coverage highlighted broader systemic change, not just his personal narrative. Meanwhile, Arlington PD tried to control the fallout, issuing statements expressing regret without admitting liability, but the damage was done. Not because of social media outrage, but because within the military and veteran communities, word had spread. One of their own had been dragged through the dirt for no reason, and he had responded not with vengeance but leadership. General Tanner continued to act as both ally and advisor, helping Kane navigate the bureaucratic minefields of cross-agency reform, and in those late-night sessions filled with cold coffee and tactical whiteboards, the real battle began, not one fought with rifles but with data, policy proposals, and patient advocacy. Kane's contacts in intelligence and special operations began feeding him anonymized reports. Dozens of incidents involving veterans misidentified, misunderstood, or mistreated due to lack of context or training. Kane was building a case not just for his dignity, but for national correction. And still, through it all, he remained shockingly private, only appearing publicly when it mattered, at hearings, at roundtables, at community sessions where the families of other veterans thanked him not for his military service, but for this new mission. Because in showing restraint, in showing composure under wrongful detention, he had given them something rare, a mirror to the nation's flaws, and a model of how to confront them with both courage and grace. And back at the dealership, where it had all begun, the staff never looked at their parking lot the same way again, because they had seen not just a man in cuffs, but a quiet sentinel waiting for justice, and a general who didn't just salute rank, but protected it too. The ripple effect of Marcus Kane's public humiliation and the subsequent response by General Tanner wasn't just a local incident anymore. It had evolved into a seismic disturbance across the intertwined worlds of military decorum, civilian, justice and institutional respect. And as the days turned into weeks, the weight of what had happened began to test the very fabric of systems that had long been running on outdated assumptions and unchecked power structures. The Kane Initiative, now formally operational and gaining traction, had become more than a symbolic gesture. It was a mission with teeth, backed by real intelligence, funding from veteran support networks, and an army of quiet allies within, military circles, legal boards, and civil rights watchdogs who were ready to act. Behind the scenes, Kane had assembled what one Pentagon staffer called a task force without insignia, a collection of quietly powerful individuals, from ex-JAG officers to active intelligence analysts, from VA reform specialists to former Black Ops handlers, who understood that what had happened in that dealership wasn't just about race or uniforms. It was about a dangerous gap in societal recognition of what service and sacrifice actually looked like in civilian clothes. As Kane continued to operate from his modest apartment near the city, turning it into a hub of strategy meetings, virtual briefings, and silent determination, the police department involved found itself in a state of internal chaos, not just because of the backlash, but because several of its own officers, themselves veterans or close to military families, began raising questions in roll calls and debriefs, slowly pushing the narrative away from blind defense into introspection, even rebellion. Chief Avery, who had once proudly declared his department above reproach, was now fielding internal memos and formal complaints about a culture of casual profiling and procedural arrogance, and though his instinct was to clamp down, his command advisors warned him that suppressing the questions now might invite federal scrutiny, especially since Kane's initiative had now been endorsed by a bipartisan congressional task force looking into law enforcement and veteran reintegration policy. Meanwhile, Danielle, the dealership manager, who had stood her ground during Kane's arrest, had become an unlikely face of civilian allyship, interviewed by regional press, invited to speak on corporate ethics panels, and quietly advised by Kane himself on how to avoid turning her support into a spectacle or a brand. What few people knew, however, was that Kane was playing a far more intricate game behind the curtain. He wasn't just reacting, he was planning, using the event as a proving ground to expose flaws in how local and federal agencies communicated, how databases failed to surface military distinctions in high-stakes civilian moments, and how perception of threat was too often filtered through racial assumptions before tactical analysis. Every night, Kane reviewed footage, police manuals, case studies of wrongful detainment involving veterans, and every morning he would run his routine physical training like clockwork, not because he had something to prove, but because discipline kept his mind razor-sharp, ready for the meetings and conference calls that now filled his days. General Tanner remained a steadfast ally, appearing occasionally in person, but mostly orchestrating support from the higher echelons of command. He had gotten permission from the Secretary of Defense to attach Kane's case as an anonymous case study in a forthcoming ethics and leadership symposium, and more importantly, he had begun laying the groundwork for Kane's next move. Full reinstatement not just of his rank, but of his capacity to serve as a civilian military liaison, a role rarely granted to anyone who had left the service without formal retirement. This designation would allow Kane to act with quasi-military authority in policy-shaping spaces while remaining a private citizen, a balance that gave him unique leverage in meetings with both law enforcement and civilian oversight committees. And while Kane appreciated the gesture, he reminded Tanner and everyone else around him that his fight was never about returning to rank or resuming glory. It was about building a new kind of bridge between those who served and the society that too often forgot them the moment the uniform came off. Even as accolades began to trickle in, a citation from a National Veterans Alliance, a silent commendation from an intelligence agency he once supported undercover, Kane remained focused, refusing public awards, opting instead to redirect that energy toward action. One of his most impactful moves came during a closed-door session with state police liaisons, where Kane presented a training model that didn't just outline veteran recognition protocols, but offered immersive scenario-based exercises where officers would be forced to confront their unconscious biases not through punishment, but through critical empathy and high-stress simulations that mirrored real-world misunderstandings. The presentation was received with a mix of awe and defensiveness, but Kane's calm, unimpeachable delivery, backed by both tactical credentials and lived experience, left few in doubt that what he proposed wasn't just necessary, but inevitable. In one particularly powerful moment during a session with young cadets, Kane walked them through his own arrest, moment by moment, without bitterness but with surgical precision, and then asked them a single question. At what moment did I stop being a civilian and start being a threat in your eyes? A silence followed that no instructor dared break, because it wasn't rhetorical. It was an autopsy of assumptions, and while all this happened, Kane was also quietly mentoring a small group of younger veterans who had reached out to him, survivors of similar incidents who had until now buried their stories, their dignity, even their mental health under layers of shame or stoic endurance. To them, Kane was more than a symbol. He was a lighthouse proving that grace under fire could still ignite revolution without a single shot. And yet, even as Kane's influence grew, he remained aware of the backlash forming in darker corners, anonymous. Threats, smear attempts about his service record, all easily refuted, and local figures who saw his rise as an indictment of their legacy. Kane didn't fear them, but he did respect the danger of complacency, which is why he began to prepare for what he knew was coming next, institutional resistance at a higher level. He doubled his documentation, encrypted every communication, and began assembling a network of legal advisors, cybersecurity experts, and civil rights lawyers who believed in his mission not just because of what happened to him, but because they saw in Kane a blueprint for how America might finally treat its warriors as more than weapons or myths, but as citizens who deserved peace, dignity, and recognition. And through it all, Kane never stopped showing up, to hearings, to town halls, to barbecues thrown by fellow vets who just wanted to thank him in person, their handshakes sometimes trembling, not from nerves, but from relief. Because finally, someone had stood up not with anger, but with unshakable clarity, and forced a nation to take notice. By the time Marcus Kane stepped onto the steps of the Capitol Annex building in Washington, D.C., the morning sky above was a piercing shade of blue, unclouded, unwavering, just like the resolve he carried in his chest. And as cameras, veterans, reporters, and bystanders held their breath in anticipation, Marcus was not thinking about glory, justice, or revenge. He was thinking about the next generation of soldiers, sons and daughters of farmers, immigrants, mechanics, and teachers, who would one day walk into a country that either saw them with honor or overlooked them with ignorance. This hearing, which had quietly escalated from a subcommittee session on police reform to a nationally broadcast congressional inquiry into veteran mistreatment, was no longer just about one incident in a used car dealership. It had become a defining moment in how America addressed the invisible war many of its warriors faced when returning home, not to flags and parades, but to assumptions, suspicion, and systemic silence. Inside the polished marble halls, Kane sat alone at the witness table, his suit crisp, his posture upright, his presence magnetic without performance, and behind him, an audience like no other. Military brass in uniform, civic leaders, legal, scholars, veterans in faded bull caps with embroidered units and campaign ribbons, Gold Star families clutching photos, and ordinary citizens who had followed his story with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. What Kane offered in his testimony was not outrage, but a masterclass in clarity. He walked the panel through the incident in surgical detail, not as a victim, but as a tactician, exposing gaps in interagency communication, the dangerous precedent of profiling veterans of color, and the failure of systems to recognize military status in civilian databases, all while anchoring every word in documented policy, human experience, and ethical obligation. He did not spare the institutions, but neither did he vilify them. His criticism was measured, his solutions actionable, and every sentence reinforced what had become his unshakable thesis. A nation that forgets the full humanity of its defenders loses the right to call itself honorable. But the climax of the day was not Kane's speech. It came after, when a retired Army sergeant stood during the closing remarks, unscripted, and asked the room to rise, and one by one, every person present, from civilian to senator, stood and gave Marcus Kane the full military salute he had been denied, not by protocol but by prejudice, in that dealership weeks ago. The gesture rippled outward, becoming a viral moment, headlines christening it the salute heard across the nation, and while Kane accepted it with solemn grace, he immediately redirected attention back to the legislative package now being debated, a federal mandate for the Veteran Recognition and Civil Protections Act, which would include advanced officer training, real-time veteran verification systems, and strict protocols for detainment involving military personnel and former operatives. As the bill advanced, Kane returned home not to applause but to quiet, because true to form he remained rooted not in celebration but in strategy. He worked late nights with policy teams, continued mentoring young veterans, and took no salary for his advisory role to the Department of Justice, insisting that his integrity remain unpurchased, unfiltered. Meanwhile, across the country, police academies began adopting his training modules, agencies revised outdated databases, and even Hollywood studios began reaching out to adapt his story, not for entertainment, but as curriculum for understanding. The real cost of erasure and the power of standing your ground without raising your voice. The officers who had once handcuffed Kane were not vilified, but reassigned to participate in the Kane Protocol workshops, and one of them, in a heartfelt panel discussion, admitted that before that day, he'd never realized how easily uniforms, skin color, and silence could be misread when stripped of context. Kane did not gloat. He simply nodded and thanked the officer for growing past his fear. And in perhaps the most symbolic gesture of all, General Tanner, who had walked into that precinct weeks ago with the force of an institution behind him, returned once more to Kane, but this time to present him not with reinstatement or rank, but with the Legion of Merit, awarded not for combat, but for moral courage and leadership in transforming how America sees its guardians, on and off the battlefield. Kane accepted it, then tucked it away, reminding everyone that medals were for museums, but reform belonged in the streets, the classrooms, and the courtrooms. And so, as the story of Marcus Kane faded from daily headlines but remained etched in institutional memory, his legacy endured, not in bronze statues or biographies, but in the quiet, permanent shift in how veterans were engaged at traffic stops, interviewed in job offices, assisted in hospitals, and acknowledged in civilian life. And every now and then, when a young recruit hears the name Kane in a training seminar, or an officer references the Marcus Clause in a handbook, the lesson is clear. One man, wrongly cuffed, stood not for vengeance, but for vision. And because of that, an entire nation began to recalibrate the weight of its salute and who truly earns it.